What is up everyone, Ewan from What Culture here, and it's time to review Shazam. No, I'm just as disappointed as you that I haven't transformed into Zachary Levi, but hey, we all got to make the best with the cards we've been dealt. The latest entry in the DC Extended Universe came to cinemas last Friday, but is it another Wonder Woman or just another Suicide Squad? Let's get stuck in, shall we? First off, Shazam revolves around the trials and tribulations of one Billy Batson. Billy is a 14-year-old orphan in the film and has run away from foster homes up and down the country, determined to find the mother he lost at a young age. When he falls into the care of a new family, Billy is bestowed the powers of Shazam and embarks on a trail of self-discovery. Meanwhile, the villainous Dr. Savannah, played by Mark Strong, is out for power himself, which puts the two characters on a crash collision, and all the doughy CGI fighting you can imagine. The actual Shazam parts are what make this film so special. I can confirm that pretty much everything you've heard about Zachary Levi's performance is true. He imbues the role with a Tom Hanks big-esque charm and emerges as potentially one of the most unique on-screen heroes of recent memory. He pretty much is Shazam and nails this world's version of Billy perfectly. Unfortunately, as with the Shazam character himself, there are two sides of the same coin. Younger Billy is portrayed by Disney Channel alum Asher Angel, and while he portrays the version of Billy very convincingly, the decision to turn the character into an angsty teen with trust issues gets very boring very quickly. The Billy Batson of the comics was always this pure of heart kid who understood the difference between right and wrong, but he's substituted for a character who literally only sighs and moans for half the film. I don't want to knock the film's message in any way because I think the family he encounters are great, but it's easy to see where his arc is heading, and the conclusion is about as close to maybe the real Shazam was the friends we made along the way as it could get. Not to get too bogged down in hypotheticals too much, but I genuinely think it would have been a lot more interesting to see the pure Billy of the comics get corrupted by his power. This Billy misuses his gifts for most of the film anyway, but there was an opportunity to have a really interesting conversation about how power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned individuals. Instead, we get a fairly unlikable introvert who's about as far away from the older Billy as you could get, and he's just not as interesting as his adoptive siblings. It won't be particularly surprising to anyone who's been following the movie's marketing campaign, but yes, Zachary Levi absolutely kills as the titular superhero in this film. Levi's dashing good looks and ridiculous build make him fit the physical requirements of the role like a glove. But what takes his performance to the next level is how thoroughly convincing he is as a teenage boy in a superhero's body. His energy is totally infectious, and he's missed for every brief time he's off screen after being introduced. Even in its more labored moments, Levi's charismatic, enormously likable turn keeps the film on the right side of entertaining. Which brings us to his other half, Dr. Savannah, played by Mark Strong. Strong is always a reliable choice to play a suitably imposing villain, so it's a bit of a disappointment that his efforts feel pretty wasted on an antagonist this generic and unmemorable. To be fair, Thaddeus Savannah's origin story is actually admirably straightforward and tragic, but Strong is given desperately little to do as a present-day Savannah. He plays the movie's straight man about as well as expected, but tethering him to 7 dodgy CGI monsters for most of the movie wasn't a particularly inspired or interesting choice. Savannah also spends massive chunks of the film off screen, and neither the character nor the actor playing him really get to put much personality across in the role. Granted, just about any straight playing performance would seem a bit flat opposite the effervescence of Zachary Levi, but even so, Savannah is probably the DCEU's least memorable main villain today, and that's saying something. These problems become doubly apparent given the film's length. On paper, Shazam seemed like a movie that would clock in at a tidy 110 minutes and basically serve up snappy, breakneck laughs all the way to the end credits, but it's actually on the surprisingly lengthy side for a movie this simple and silly, clocking in at a hefty 132 minutes, which unfortunately doesn't fully justify. The pacing is basically all over the place. It's well over a half hour before Shazam, Levi makes his first appearance, and after a solid hour of origin story shenanigans, the third act showdown ends up outstaying its welcome by a good 10 or so minutes. Now, don't get me wrong, it's certainly not a chore to watch Shazam at any moment, but it's definitely longer than it needs or wants to be, which makes the fairly uninventive finale a tad more tedious to contemplate. To be completely fair to director David F. Sandberg, Spielberg, Shazam was made for only about $90 million, a paltry budget compared to the $200+ million price tags of some other DCEU movies. And it certainly isn't a bad-looking film, but it also doesn't look particularly interesting either. You'd think that after all the criticism of Zack Snyder's movies being too drab and colourless, we'd see a ton of brightness and vibrancy in this film, but shockingly enough, far too much of the movie is grey and kind of washed out. Snyder's films at least had memorable shot compositions despite their overall sloppiness, yet most of the on-ground scenes here wouldn't look out of place in a well-made TV film. The superhero shenanigans are meanwhile fine if formulaic, typically dissolving into the usual blurry, overdone VFX onslaught the DCEU has been typified by. Ultimately, despite its charms, aesthetically speaking, Shazam can rival Suicide Squad as the most tepid-looking DCEU film to date. Fortunately, the film also has a lot of heart. The young actors comprising Billy's foster family are all terrific, with the easy standout being Faith Herman as Darla Dudley, the youngest and chattiest member of the family. As foster parents Victor and Rosa Vasquez, Cooper Andrews and Marta Milans also turn in compassionate and surprisingly fleshed-out performances. There are several other turns which can't even be talked about for spoiler-related reasons, but rest assured that everybody brings their finest efforts to the table here. Superhero movies often struggle with the emotional stuff, if only because the character-driven aspects so often feel lazy and arbitrary, as though tacked on while the screenwriter ticks off a list. Thankfully, that's not the case at all in Shazam, and despite the obvious silliness of the story, it has a real beating heart at its core, which, without spoiling anything, pays off splendidly. Literally nobody on the planet is going to complain that Shazam is a movie that takes itself too seriously, that's for sure. An almost impossibly silly wish fulfillment fantasy, the film is as fun as it is because Billy as Shazam does exactly what most of us would do. He uses his powers to charge people's phones, he robs ATMs, he buys some beer, and occasionally he battles the bad guys, but only occasionally. An array of hysterical one-liners gently mock both the superhero movie and coming-of-age films, while proving unafraid to go to some risque places. It all adds up to a film that, in the very least, should leave viewers chuckling away with sure regularity. It is a case of the material and the cast complementing one another exceptionally well, ensuring that even when the movie gets occasionally brutal, and trust me, it does get really brutal in parts, it doesn't upend the overall sense of daftness. Also worth mentioning is Benjamin Wallfish's sweeping musical score. Wallfish's composition doesn't reach the iconic heights of Hans Zimmer's work on Man of Steel, but it's still pretty damn good. The brassy musical score here is clearly inspired by the classic orchestral sweep of John Williams' score for the original 1978 Superman film, and while you might not leave the cinema quite humming the hero theme yet, there's still a sure uplift to Wallfish's solid musical suite. It's especially refreshing following in the footsteps of Aquaman's more electronic-infused stylings, and it's possible that repeat viewings might allow the punchy fanfare to stick in the mind a little easier. It certainly isn't new that films within the DCEU boast a somewhat memorable composition, Man of Steel and Wonder Woman the two standouts, but it's also worth bearing in mind just how much Shazam embraces Warner Bros.' much maligned franchise. It wouldn't have been remotely surprising if Shazam ended up feeling like a DCEU movie that was a bit embarrassed to admit it was a DCEU movie, and in light of Justice League's failure, it pretty much just functioned as a totally standalone superhero movie. So, a surprise it is to report that Shazam is a movie fully, proudly in the thrall of an on-screen universe, yet never in a manner where it feels like it's desperately reaching for time potential with other superheroes. There are literally dozens of name drops, references, and sight gags related to Superman and Batman alone, to say nothing of more subtle nods to Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and The Flash. Though there aren't any explicit tips of the hat to the events of recent DCEU movies, the film does a fantastic job immersing its characters in the same world without ever taking things too far. So, what of the film overall? Well, it's definitely good. Levi is impeccable as the OG Captain Marvel, and it wears the unabashed silliness of DC source material on its sleeve. That in itself deserves to be championed, especially since so many of DC's films have been justifiably criticized for shying away from their bonkers roots. It's genuinely enjoyable, and though it's also flawed in places, it's guaranteed to put a smile on every DC fan's face. That's why I'm gonna give it 3 stars. But I want to know what you all thought of Shazam down in the comments below. Was it to your liking, or did it carry on just a little bit too much in the end?
Be sure to post your thoughts down in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want more, and head back on over to whatculture.com for more news, reviews, analysis, lists, and articles every day. As always, I've been Ewan. You can follow me on Twitter @EwanRunesThings, and I'll catch you next time. Shazam!